On Christmas Eve 1972, dozens of American B-52 bombers flew over the Vietnamese sky, in what went down in history as one of the largest U.S. bombing raids, Operation Linebacker 2. But that awesome flex of war muscle was totally useless. By the time the operation was over, more than a dozen aircraft had been turned to burning scrap by a venerable Soviet missile, the S-75 VNA. In this new installment of military aviation, we want to detail everything that happened in those weeks of December 1972, when Vietnam gave the United States an aerial beating, with a little help from its friends in the Soviet Union. By 1972, the situation in Southeast Asia was untenable for all parties. The Vietnam War had gone on longer than planned and was draining U.S. reserves. That is why, in December of that year, one of the largest air attack campaigns ever carried out by the United States was launched, Operation Linebacker 2, carried out by the 7th Air Force and Navy Task Force 77, between December 18th and 29th. A kind of explosive Christmas present for the Vietnamese troops. Unlike operations like Rolling Thunder, Linebacker 2 sought to psychologically subdue the enemy, destroying the main target complexes in the Hanoi and Haiphong areas. Such a mission could only be carried out by American B-52s. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress is a long-range subsonic strategic bomber that, since its commissioning in 1955, has become a fundamental piece for the projection of American power by air. As its name indicates, it is a true air fortress, capable of transporting a large amount of destructive material and carrying out sustained operations over a specific territory. It was the ideal choice to rain down fire on the most important bases in Vietnam. In total, during Operation Linebacker 2, B-52s dropped 15,327 tons of bombs in 741 flights over North Vietnam. In numbers, this looks like a landslide victory, but during the operation the United States suffered some of the most painful and humiliating casualties of the entire campaign. The main obstacle for the B-52s was a modern Soviet-produced air defense system, the venerable S-75 VNA, known as the SA-2 guideline after its NATO designation. The S-75 is basically a surface-to-air missile that uses high-altitude command guidance to hit its targets. Since its commissioning in 1957, it has become the most widely deployed air defense missile in history, largely due to its many successes in protecting the skies of the Soviet allies. In fact, it achieved the first kill of an enemy aircraft by an anti-aircraft missile. On October 7, 1959, the S-75 destroyed a Taiwanese Martin RB-57D Canberra while flying over China. Back then, the shootdown was blamed on Chinese fighters of the time to keep the VNA's power hidden. As you will see, this missile really changed the history of aviation, being a formidable enemy for any aircraft. Regarding the launcher and missile, there are numerous variants that have received upgrades over the years, but the ones that were stationed in Vietnam had the ability to launch a 195-kilogram warhead over 30,000 meters altitude with a velocity of Mach 3. In total, North Vietnam had 26 S-75 systems protecting the Hanoi and Haiphong area. This was supplemented by various combat and intercept aircraft, and some radar stations that monitored the skies. The B-52 fleet employed in Operation Linebacker 2 consisted primarily of G and D models. All D models had been upgraded with state-of-the-art electronic countermeasures, but only half of the G models had been upgraded, so they were easier to seek and destroy by the S-75 VNA. To make matters worse, the tactics of the B-52 fleet had changed virtually nothing since World War II. On December 18, 1972, 87 B-52s took off from Andersen Air Force Base on Guam. Another 42 units did the same from the U Tapao Airport in Thailand. During the first night of Operation Linebacker 2, North Vietnamese forces fired nearly 200 S-75 missiles, of which at least 5 hit their targets. That day 3 American bombers were shot down and at least 2 others were seriously damaged. It was as if you could jump from missile to missile, they had fired so many, the brightness was such that you could read a newspaper in the cockpit, recalls one of the Americans who participated in the attack. Not an ideal start, the loss of so many B-52s took a toll on U.S. troop morale and reignited the North Vietnamese forces. Nguyen Van Phiet, a Vietnamese soldier who destroyed 4 B-52s, recalls the shock he had that night. "We were all afraid of the B-52s because they seemed invincible. After that first night it became clear that they could be shot down like any other aircraft. The second night of Operation Linebacker was much better for the United States. No shootdowns were recorded and only 2 aircraft returned with structural damage to their respective bases. That day, 93 flights were achieved, with a fairly high average effectiveness. The problem is that, by the third night, the Vietnamese had managed to figure out the strategy of the American pilots. The bombers flew in large columns on predetermined routes. Once their cargo was dropped, they would do a few turns, bank the plane, and then do a U-turn to return to their base. The moment in which the B-52s opened the hatches to drop the bombs was particularly sensitive, since they exponentially increased their radar signature, exposing themselves to detection by the SAMs. During the third night of the operation, 6 B-52s were shot down, sending Washington into a state of hysteria. Nixon was furious. That small country in Southeast Asia was inflicting unexpected damage on the fleet of the best bomber on the planet. Operation Linebacker 2 had been intended as a psychological blow to North Vietnam, but, thanks to Vietnamese victories, it was having the opposite effect. Since then, the flights have been carried out with variations in routes and altitudes, without once repeating the route used in previous attacks. During the fourth night, 2 kills were recorded. Thereafter, the United States improvised new tactics, and by the end of Operation Linebacker, a total of 15 B-52s had been shot down, with 33 crewmen killed. A grim aspect of these missions is that, when carried out at night, the bombers returned to a base in total darkness. It wasn't until the next day that the whole team found out about the colleagues and friends who had died during the night. The effects of Operation Linebacker 2 were devastating for both sides. 1,600 Vietnamese were killed in those December weeks, and many major bases were damaged beyond repair. To this day, the region is littered with ruined buildings and craters in the ground. On the U.S. side, not only did public opinion of the war worsen, but tens of millions of dollars in war material was lost and, for practical purposes, the operation achieved none of its objectives. North Vietnam remained operational and its soldiers were even hungrier for victory, and the American pilots were terrified to undertake another similar mission again. It did not surprise anyone that on January 27, 1973, a little less than a month after the end of the Linebacker 2 operation, the peace accords that began the long period of withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam were signed in Paris. We have reached the end of this video. If you like this content, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications. For now, we are waiting for you in the next installment to continue learning everything about the world of military aviation.